I've been focusing a lot on this story about the massive prison sentences that were just handed down in the case of the Prairieland activists that were protesting against ICE. I did a video explaining the details of the case. If you're not familiar with it, I'll leave a link in the comments or maybe up here if I figure out how to do that. But these were activists that got anywhere between 30 and 100 years in prison, some of whom were only moving a box of zines or using a signal app or wearing black. In many ways, the sentences in this case set a dangerous new precedent. But this type of persecution is nothing new for anarchists living in the imperial core. The American state has been waging a war on anarchists for at least 140 years. The United States government began to specifically target anarchists in the late 1800s because of their influence on the growing labor movements of the time, with an incident known as the Haymarket Affair kicking off the first major wave of repression. In the spring of 1886, there were massive protests and strikes in Chicago, pushing for an 8-hour workday, escalating on May 1st when tens of thousands of workers walked off the job. At a McCormick factory, the company brought in scabs to break the strike, which resulted in a tense confrontation at the factory gates between the scabs and the strikers on May 3rd. That's when police stormed in and opened fire on the workers, killing at least 2 people. The next night, anarchist labor leaders planned a protest at Haymarket Square in response to the killings. The mayor of Chicago stopped by and called it peaceful. It was in the process of breaking up because of the rain, when police stormed in there and forced everybody to leave. Then someone threw a bomb and chaos broke out. One cop was killed, and then the cops opened fire on a bunch of protesters. They never found out who threw the bomb, but 8 anarchists were arrested and tried anyway. Most of them weren't even at the event that day, and there was no evidence to show that any of them who were on trial had anything to do with any bombs. But they were convicted on the same type of conspiracy reasoning that the Prairieland activists were convicted for today. It was said that even though none of them threw the bomb, that they influenced the person who did through their speeches and their newspapers. 4 were executed, 1 died in their cell, and then 3 more were ultimately pardoned a few years later, when the governor pardoned them, admitting that the whole trial was a sham. A few years later, in 1901, a man named Leon Kozlk shot President William McKinley at a public event in Buffalo. He called himself an anarchist, but he had acted alone and he was not really affiliated with anybody in the movement. Still, police arrested Emma Goldman and other well-known anarchists anyway, but they ultimately let them go when no conspiracy was found. To prevent that from happening again, they moved to take away the free speech of anarchists. Congress then passed the Immigration Act of 1903, which was also known as the Anarchist Exclusion Act. Under this new law, nobody who believed in or advocated for the overthrow of government would be allowed in the country. This was the first federal law that sought to exclude people because of their ideas. A bit later, when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the government went after the industrial workers of the world, a group that was also known as the Wobblies at the time, mainly because of their opposition to the war. They rightly saw it as a fight that would benefit the bosses, not the workers who would be sent to die in it. And they were one of the loudest and most powerful anti-war groups in the country at the time. To crack down on them, the government used the newly passed Espionage Act. In September of 1917, federal agents raided IWW halls across the country, seized tons of the union's documents and letters, and arrested around 165 of its leaders. They were charged with conspiring to obstruct the draft and undermine the war. There were already previous investigations into the Wobblies to see if they were a foreign agent working for the Germans, and the investigation turned up nothing. But the government still attempted to build a case, and the only evidence was the group's pamphlets and newspapers. At a trial, again in Chicago in 1918, 101 of them were convicted. Big Bill Haywood, the most famous Wobbly, got 20 years. More than 20 additional states across the country passed criminal syndicalism laws, which made it a felony to belong to a group that advocated for radical change, whether or not you had ever acted on it. In some states, you could be convicted for having once been a member of the IWW. And then in other states, you could be arrested for hiring an anarchist. Then after the war, there was the Red Scare. Congress passed the Sedition Act of 1918, which made disloyal speech a crime. And then the Immigration Act of 1918, which let the government deport immigrants simply for being anarchists. In 1919, a group of anarchists called the Gallienists ran a bombing campaign against politicians, judges, and businessmen. They were followers of Luigi Galliani, who preached what anarchists of the era called the propaganda of the deed. The idea that violence against the state was a legitimate political tool, not just an act of last resort. In June of that year, one of them blew up the house of the Attorney General and ended up blowing themselves up in the process. The Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, then used that as an excuse to come down hard on anarchists. Palmer used the bombings as a pretext to build a new division to hunt down radicals, and that division was actually run by a young J. Edgar Hoover. Then they started rounding people up, and they went far beyond the Gallienists and anybody who had anything to do with any bombings. On the night of December 21st, 1919, federal agents loaded over 200 people on a ship and sent them back to Russia. This included Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They were two of the most prominent anarchists in the country at the time. Weeks later, agents raided dozens of cities in a single night and arrested thousands of people. Most of them were never actually charged with anything, and the bombers were never even caught. Then decades later, there was COINTELPRO, a government program that was specifically designed to target radical groups. A Senate committee that later investigated the program called it an attack on freedom of speech and freedom of association. The Black Panthers were one of the main targets of COINTELPRO. And through this program, the government was able to take out their leaders through informants, false charges, and in some cases even murder. They also caused disputes and arguments between radical groups as a way of keeping them splintered and powerless. As with many infamous government programs, the tactics that they used still live on even after the program shut down. When the anti-globalization movement put anarchists back in the streets, starting with the shutdown of the World Trade Center meeting in Seattle in 1999, the state answered with infiltration and conspiracy charges. In 2008, it hit 8 members of an anarchist group with a charge called conspiracy to riot in the furtherance of terrorism. It was the first use of Minnesota's state version of the Patriot Act. These terrorism charges were ultimately dropped because the government couldn't find anything on these protesters. Then more recently, there was the Green Scare of the 2000s, which is still going on today to some extent as well, and could be facing a revival pretty soon. After September 11th, the government also began to label a lot of environmental groups and also animal rights groups as terrorists. The FBI called the Earth Liberation Front the nation's top domestic terrorist threat, even though they never killed anybody. They mostly damaged property. In a sweep called Operation Backfire, the government arrested activists for a string of arsons going back years, all of them targeted at property and none of them at people. The sentences were inflated by terrorism charges, and they used a new law built after the Oklahoma City bombing that lets a judge add years to a sentence for property crime meant to influence the government. Daniel McGowan got 7 years for 2 arsons and was sent to a special prison unit to control his communication. Around the same time, a group of activists known as the SHAC7 were convicted of terrorism for running a website that publicized protests against an animal testing company. They hadn't carried out any actions, they just reported on them, and they were still treated like terrorists. So many of these cases have so many similarities with the massive wave of repression that we're seeing against anarchists and Antifa activists today. One of the things that the government used to convict the Prairieland defendants was their membership in an anarchist book club named after Emma Goldman, who was deported from this country over 100 years ago for her ideas.